At my daughter's wedding, her groom introduced me as an unemployed nobody. He smirked, proud of his success. But when my true identity was revealed, his entire world collapsed in front of everyone. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The wedding hall was dressed in white flowers and polished glass, sunlight catching on crystal chandeliers as guests shifted in their seats. Nancy glowed in her gown, her eyes darting nervously between her groom and her father. Derek Harrington, tall, confident, perfectly fitted into his suit, held court like the room belonged to him. When he turned to introduce the man standing just behind his bride, his words were coated with pride and quiet cruelty. "This is Nancy's father," he said with a practiced smile. "An unemployed man just enjoying retirement." A ripple of laughter moved through the guests, polite and shallow, the kind of chuckles that disguise discomfort. Some smiled, others looked away, but all of them heard it clearly. The father was framed as useless, a man who had stepped out of the current of life and been left behind. The moment stretched. Nancy's face colored, torn between love for her husband and loyalty to her father. Derek tightened his grip on her hand, confident, certain he had drawn the boundary of the story for everyone to see. The father, standing calmly, offered no protest. His lips curved into the smallest of smiles, but behind his steady gaze, something colder and sharper was alive. He had been dismissed, judged by appearances, and reduced to a line Derek thought would win favor with his boss and colleagues. Instead, it echoed louder than intended, exposing the arrogance that had been building for months. The guests shifted again, unease hanging in the air, but Derek basked in his own performance, oblivious to the fault line he had opened. The father lowered his eyes briefly, as though in quiet surrender, but in his chest the truth burned steady and bright. They thought he was powerless, a man past his prime, with nothing left to give. Derek thought he was safe in his assumption, certain the wedding day would cement his rise. He was wrong. The father's quiet thought cut like steel. He believed I was powerless. What he didn't know was that I owned his future. The Lakeview Grill was lit in warm tones of amber and gold, its wide windows catching the last streaks of sunlight from the lake outside. It was the kind of place Derek Harrington liked to show off, upscale but not too exclusive, perfect for projecting success without having to reach too far beyond his means. He smoothed his tie as the waiter led them to a corner table, Nancy glowing with excitement at the thought of her father and fiancé sharing a meal together. For her, it was a chance to bridge worlds. For Derek, it was an opportunity to perform. No sooner had the menus been placed than Derek launched into his story. He leaned back in his chair with practiced ease, announcing his role at Technova Innovations, his department's sales growth, his long hours, his sacrifices. He spoke with the tone of a man certain the world was taking notes, each detail punctuated with subtle reminders of his rising trajectory. His voice carried across the table, not in curiosity about the man opposite him but in self-assured lecture. "So, Mr. Wood," Derek said smoothly, "Nancy tells me you're between opportunities right now." The phrase hung in the air, dipped in condescension. The father unfolded his napkin carefully, his reply simple, "I'm retired." Derek's smile widened, feigning politeness. "Right, of course." When the orders were placed, the contrast sharpened. Derek's pan-seared salmon with truffle risotto gleamed with extravagance. Nancy chose her chicken, her eyes bright with anticipation. Her father, scanning the menu briefly, asked for the soup and sandwich combo. Derek's eyebrows lifted, just slightly, but the expression said, "Everything." "Budgets," Derek remarked offhandedly, waving his hand as though explaining away a minor flaw. "Everyone has them." The word struck like a slap, but the father remained composed, his fingers tightening around the glass of water only for a moment, before releasing. Nancy flushed, her cheeks pink with quiet embarrassment. "Dad likes simple food," she said gently, trying to shield him from the sting. Derek smiled, as if he understood everything. Of course, of course. Different circumstances. The dismissal was wrapped in politeness but edged with steel. As the dinner continued, Derek leaned harder into his theme of generational superiority. He spoke of sacrifice, long hours, seminars, networking. Success requires staying current. You can't just coast. People get stuck in old patterns, and frankly, companies don't need dead weight. The phrase landed heavily, but Derek carried on, unaware of how his words sharpened into insults. Experience without adaptation is just stagnation, he added, his fork gesturing like a weapon of authority. The father listened, his expression calm, his posture steady, even as Derek layered judgment upon judgment. Each phrase was stored carefully, filed away like evidence for a trial not yet called. Nancy reached for her father's hand, her voice softer now, almost pleading. Derek just means the world has changed since your time. Exactly, Derek agreed, puffing his chest. Evolution. Survival of the fittest. That's what drives innovation. That's what separates winners from the ones who settle. His glance at the soup bowl made the insult unmistakable. The father set down his spoon with quiet precision, the sound of metal against ceramic sharper than Derek anticipated. He said nothing more than a simple phrase. Settling can be a choice. The words floated across the table, calm and controlled, a quiet warning unnoticed by the man too busy savoring his own perceived victory. Nancy's eyes flickered between them, sensing tension she couldn't ease. Derek, however, pressed on, brimming with certainty. He spoke of promotions, regional management, the dead weight he would one day cut loose. He believed he was demonstrating his brilliance. In truth, he was giving away every flaw, every weakness. The father sat back, letting him speak, his silence not surrender but strategy. By the time dessert was offered, the hierarchy Derek had tried to build was clear in his mind. He had established himself as the successful provider, the visionary, the man on the rise. The father, in Derek's telling, was an old relic with soup in front of him. But in silence, with every word stored carefully, the real story was beginning to form. The soup arrived steaming, the aroma of tomato and basil lifting softly into the air. The father raised the spoon with deliberate care, savoring it in quiet appreciation. Derek Harrington, however, couldn't leave the choice untouched. He gestured lightly with his fork toward the bowl. Soup and a sandwich, he said, his tone pitched just loud enough for Nancy to hear. It's fine, of course. Everyone has different budgets. The father didn't flinch, but Nancy's cheeks flushed crimson. She touched Derek's arm gently, whispering, "Dad just prefers simple food." Derek nodded, pretending to understand, though his eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of an unspoken superiority. "Of course," he said again, each repetition dripping with condescension. The evening stretched out, one insult after another, woven through Derek's rehearsed tales of triumph. He spoke of long hours at Technova Innovations, of the sacrifices he had made, of how his department's sales had increased by 40% since his arrival. His voice carried the rhythm of someone performing a monologue, not sharing a conversation. "You have to be aggressive," Derek declared, slicing into his salmon with precision. "The business world moves fast. Adapt or get left behind. That's the reality. Some people just coast, and companies can't afford to carry dead weight anymore." The word lingered between them like smoke. Dead weight. The father lifted his glass, taking a slow sip of water. His voice was mild, his tone calm. "The older employees must have experience, though. Doesn't that count for something?" Derek shrugged, dismissing the question with a wave of his fork. "Experience without adaptation is stagnation. The truth is, most of the senior staff are dragging us down. If I had my way, half of them would be replaced with hungry young talent who understand the modern landscape. That's how innovation happens." Nancy shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between the two men. She wanted to defend her father, but Derek's confidence was relentless. a wall of self-assurance she couldn't breach. The father stirred his soup thoughtfully, watching Derek carefully. He wasn't angry. He was collecting, cataloging every phrase, every judgment, each one a piece of evidence building toward something Derek could not yet imagine. Derek leaned back in his chair, his voice growing louder, his gestures more expansive. The thing is, Mr. Wood, your generation doesn't really get it. No offense, but times are different now. It's not enough to just work hard. You need vision, strategy, disruption. You have to challenge paradigms, not just repeat what's always been done. Disrupting paradigms, the father repeated softly, letting the phrase roll over his tongue like an unfamiliar spice. Exactly, Derek said, mistaking the echo for admiration. That's what separates winners from losers. And that's why I'll be department director in a year, regional manager in 3. Success doesn't just happen. You build it with goals, sacrifices, and ambition. Nancy tried to smile, nodding in encouragement, but her eyes flickered with worry. She knew her father's silence wasn't ignorance. It was patience. The father tilted his head slightly, his voice steady. Ambition is important. But sometimes the most important goals aren't obvious to outsiders. Derek missed the warning entirely. Exactly, he said eagerly. That's why I stay ahead. Seminars, networking, constant adaptation. I know where the future is headed. People stuck in old methods don't stand a chance. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Between you and me, I've seen older workers crumble. They can't keep up with the pace. The company has to carry them like excess baggage. Nancy's hand tightened around her napkin, but she stayed quiet, unwilling to spark a fight. The father finished the last of his soup and set the spoon down with deliberate precision. The soft clink against the ceramic bowl silenced the air for a moment. Settling, he said quietly, can be a choice. Derek chuckled, mistaking the calm for surrender. That's the attitude, I suppose. Staying positive about circumstances. But really, Mr. Wood, have you thought about consulting? With your experience, maybe you could find opportunities. Something modest, of course. Or, if you'd like, I could introduce you to some contacts. Entry-level positions, nothing too demanding, just enough to keep you busy. The offer was made with a smile that carried no kindness. It was a verdict, a declaration of status, dressed up as generosity. Nancy's eyes widened in disbelief. Derek, she whispered urgently, but Derek was too caught in his own performance to notice. The father's lips curved into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. That's very generous, he said evenly. Helping those less fortunate. Very generous. Indeed. Derek nodded, pleased. It's about giving back. Successful people have a responsibility to lift others up. It's not about the money for me. Don't get me wrong, the 6-figure salary is nice. But I want to make a difference. Build something meaningful. Meaningful, the father repeated, his voice steady, his expression unreadable. Derek leaned closer, his confidence swelling. That's what drives me. Passion, vision, disruption. That's what makes me valuable to the company. That's why Walter Klein notices me. That's why I'm not worried about the future. I'm the kind of person who shapes it. Nancy stared at her father, silently pleading with him not to rise to the bait. But he remained composed, his calmness only deepening. Long-term growth, Derek said, gesturing with his fork. That's what companies invest in. People who can grow with them. At your age, no offense, you're looking at maybe 5, 10 years before retirement. Companies want futures, not short-term situations. The father's gaze sharpened, but his voice stayed level. Long-term growth, he murmured. Like 30 years? Exactly, Derek said, missing the edge entirely. See, you get it. The father smiled faintly, not with warmth, but with something closer to resolve. He had heard everything he needed. The insults, the judgments, the arrogance, all of it now stored away. Derek believed he was winning the conversation. But in truth, he was writing his own undoing, sentence by sentence, brag by brag. By the time dessert menus arrived, the father had said little. but he had gathered much. Derek, meanwhile, had declared his vision, his disdain, his superiority, his belief in disruption, and his certainty in his own invincibility. When the waiter cleared the table, Derek reclined with a satisfied smirk. To him, it had been a lecture, a victory, a moment of dominance over a man he thought powerless. To the father, it was something else entirely. It was evidence. It was preparation. It was fuel for the fire to come. The drive home was silent, the streetlights sliding across the windshield as if counting down the beats of a plan still forming. When Porter Wood finally stepped into his house, he didn't linger in the living room or the kitchen. He went straight to the study, closing the door with the deliberate care of a man locking the world outside. The room breathed history. Every wall carried proof of a life Derek Harrington couldn't imagine. Along one side were photographs framed in black walnut, the earliest showing a cramped garage with two young men hunched over circuit boards. Porter stared at the picture, at his own face 30 years younger, beside Walter Clean, both smiling with exhaustion and conviction. They had believed they could change the future, and against all odds, they had. Next to the photographs hung awards lined in neat precision. Industry recognition plaques from conferences in San Francisco, Boston, Berlin, crystal trophies etched with the words innovation, excellence, leadership. Derek had dismissed all of it as luck. Yet here was the evidence of years spent fighting for ideas when no one else believed in them. On the desk lay a thick folder of patents, each with Porter's name etched in clean legal type. Half the systems Derek bragged about selling bore his signature in their earliest form. Algorithms, machine learning methods, predictive analytics frameworks, work that had become the backbone of Technova innovations long before Derek walked through its doors. Porter lowered himself into the leather chair. Its familiar creak, a reminder of nights spent drafting business plans, fighting for investors, and arguing with Walter over impossible deadlines. He pulled a yellowed clipping from a desk drawer, the Forbes article from 2018, calling him the quiet revolutionary of AI. Derek had called him unemployed, retired, dead weight. Porter set the clipping carefully on the desk and allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The phone on his desk felt heavier than usual when he picked it up. He dialed a number engraved into memory, one he hadn't needed to look up in decades. Walter answered on the second ring, just as he always had. Porter, Walter's voice carried warmth. It's been too long. How was dinner with the future son-in-law? Enlightening, Porter said evenly. Tell me, how are things at the company? Same circus, different clowns. Walter laughed. No, really, everything's steady. The board's happy. Quarterly numbers look strong. But I'll tell you, there's one sales manager making a lot of noise lately. Ambitious fellow. You might even know him. Derek Harrington. Porter leaned back, letting the name settle. I've heard the name. 3 years with us. Numbers are good, I'll give him that. He's got ideas too. But that hungry look that makes me nervous. Keeps talking about disruption, modernization, clearing out dead weight. The words landed with perfect familiarity. Porter had heard them all over dinner. What's your take? Porter asked quietly. Walter hesitated for a moment, then said, smart kid, but arrogant, too sure of himself. Ambition's a double-edged sword. It can drive a man to great things, or it can blind him to the value already in front of him. Porter's eyes flicked to the photograph on his desk, the garage where it all began. And which edge do you think Derek's leaning toward? Hard to say, Walter admitted. The board loves his energy. But me? I've seen that kind before. The kind that mistakes noise for vision. They think they're building the future, when all they're really doing is burning bridges. Porter said nothing for a long moment. Then he replied, maybe he just needs perspective. Walter chuckled softly. If anyone can give it to him, it's you. But what's this about, Porter? You sound deliberate. Just an observation, Porter said, his tone calm. Sometimes lessons come harder than expected. I'll let you get back to it. "We'll talk again soon." When the call ended, Porter sat in silence, his fingers brushing over the photograph of himself and Walter as young men. Derek thought he had measured him, thought he had filed him away as another old man coasting on borrowed time. But the truth sat here in this study, in the papers, in the patents, in the legacy of 3 decades. Porter closed the folder, his mind sharpened into purpose. Derek Harrington believed he was climbing toward the top. What he didn't know was that the man he mocked as powerless had built the very ladder he stood on. Porter remained in his study long after the call with Walter ended, the faint hum of the desk lamp filling the silence. The outlines of his plan had already started to take shape in his mind. It would require precision, patience, and above all, restraint. Revenge, after all, wasn't about striking quickly. It was about timing, about letting arrogance ripen into folly before revealing the truth. The first step was simple: do nothing. At least, not visibly. Derek had to believe that he had correctly assessed his future father-in-law as a powerless retiree with no influence. Every casual insult, every offhand remark about limitations and dead weight would only strengthen the case Porter was quietly building. Derek's downfall would not come from being contradicted. It would come from being revealed in his own words, at precisely the wrong moment, in front of the right audience. The second step was preparation. Porter knew that appearance mattered to Derek, who measured worth in cufflinks, cars, and corner offices, that vanity would become the perfect stage for revelation. So Porter began to arrange the details. A suit tailored not for flash, but for dignity, the kind of quiet elegance that whispered rather than shouted. A pair of platinum cufflinks, etched with the Technova emblem, would be his calling card. To the uninformed, they would look like any other piece of jewelry. But to Walter and to anyone else in the company who mattered, they would be a thunderclap. The third step was presentation. The wedding would be the stage, with Derek's boss and colleagues in attendance. Porter had no need to announce his role. He would let Derek introduce him however he pleased, let him boast and belittle, let him carve his own downfall with every smug remark. Then, with a few deliberate words, Porter would allow Walter to recognize him, and the entire room would see Derek for who he truly was. But beneath the calm calculations, there was something heavier pressing on Porter's chest. Nancy. His daughter had always been sharp, intuitive, and loyal. Already, she had shown signs of suspicion, watching him more closely than Derek ever had. If she confronted him directly, he would need to be careful. She was caught between love for her fiancé and love for her father, and the wrong move could tear her apart. The confrontation came sooner than expected. It was a quiet Saturday morning, when Nancy showed up at Porter's house, unannounced, her hair tied back and her expression serious. She didn't bother with pleasantries. "Dad," she said, stepping into the study and closing the door behind her, "what are you planning?" Porter looked up from the notes he had been making. He had hoped to shield her a little longer, to let her see Derek's character without the burden of knowing her father's intentions. But Nancy was not a child anymore. "I'm not sure what you mean," Porter replied evenly. "Yes, you are," Nancy shot back. Her voice wavered, but her eyes held steady. "You've been different since that dinner. You're watching Derek, writing things down, and I've seen you going through those old folders in your desk. I know Technova isn't just a company you worked at. I know you helped build it. Why are you hiding that from him?" Porter leaned back, folding his hands in his lap. "Because, sweetheart, Derek has already decided who I am. He thinks I'm beneath him. And the truth? He needs to see what it means when assumptions meet reality." Nancy's shoulders slumped, torn between understanding and unease. "So you're setting him up? You're going to humiliate him?" Porter's voice softened. "I'm going to let him humiliate himself. All I have to do is stay quiet and let his arrogance do the work." Nancy shook her head. "This isn't fair. He doesn't know who you are." "That's the point," Porter said gently. "Character isn't about how you treat people when you know they're important. It's about how you treat people when you think they're not." The words, hung in the air, and Nancy turned away, pacing the room. You could just tell him. End this now. Why drag it out? Because if I tell him, he'll change his behavior for the wrong reasons. He'll be respectful because he wants my approval, or my money, or my influence. But if I wait, if I let him reveal his true self in front of everyone, then you'll know exactly who you've married. Nancy froze, her back still turned. And if I don't like what I see, then you'll have clarity, Porter replied. Better to see the truth now than 5 years from now, when it's too late to walk away. Nancy's voice cracked when she finally turned to face him. I love him, Dad. He's not always like this. He's good to me when it's just us. Porter rose from his chair, stepping closer. Sweetheart, I don't doubt he loves you, but love without respect is fragile. And Derek has shown me, again and again, that his respect depends on appearances. That's not something you can build a marriage on. Nancy's eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded slowly. So you're really going through with this? At the wedding? Porter placed a hand on her shoulder, steady but firm. Yes, at the wedding. And when it happens, you'll have a choice. You can stand with him, or you can see him clearly. But either way, you'll know the truth. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Nancy pulled away, wiping her eyes. Just don't destroy him, Dad. Please, don't do it out of anger. Porter's expression softened. I'm not angry, Nancy. Anger burns too quickly. This isn't about revenge. It's about justice, about protecting you from a man who thinks kindness is weakness. He needs to learn that lesson, and you need to see it for yourself. Nancy nodded reluctantly and left the study, closing the door behind her. Porter returned to his desk, staring at the notes and plans laid out before him. His resolve had not wavered, but the weight of what lay ahead pressed heavier than ever. The suit would be ready in 2 weeks. The cufflinks had already been ordered. The check, a quiet symbol of wealth, would be prepared for presentation. Every detail was falling into place. All that remained was patience. Derek thought he was climbing the ladder of success, one smug remark at a time. Soon, he would learn that the man he had mocked as powerless had built the ladder itself. And when the truth came to light, it would not be loud or violent. It would be quiet, deliberate, undeniable, like the closing of a door that could never be reopened. The Drake Hotel's chapel was bathed in soft light from the stained glass windows as the rehearsal dinner began. Guests filed in with a mixture of warmth and curiosity. Many of them, Derek's colleagues from Technova, sharp suits and polished heels, marking them as career-minded professionals. Nancy moved gracefully through the small crowd, her smile bright, though her eyes occasionally flickered toward her father, as if searching for reassurance. Porter stayed calm, his presence understated, a man blending into the background exactly as Derek preferred. When Derek spotted him, his chest swelled as though he had just remembered an accessory he could use to polish his image. He strode across the chapel, gathering a small group of his co-workers along the way. His voice carried easily, not loud, but pitched perfectly to reach just enough ears. Everyone, I'd like you to meet Nancy's father, Derek announced, laying his hand on Porter's shoulder as though presenting a curiosity at an exhibition. This is Mr. Wood. He's retired now, lives modestly out in Evanston. Enjoys the simple life. The words retired and modestly lingered like polished daggers, delicately designed to cut. A few polite chuckles rose from the group, the kind people use to mask discomfort. One of Derek's colleagues, a tall man with slicked back hair, offered a nod. Always nice to see someone enjoying retirement. You must be proud of your daughter. Very proud, Porter replied smoothly, his smile warm, his tone unshaken. He could feel Derek's eyes on him, searching for a flicker of embarrassment. He gave him none. Derek pressed forward, sensing an opportunity to burnish his own image. Dad's got simple tastes, but that's fine, right? Different generations, different expectations. He's not one to chase after all this corporate ladder climbing. He's more about peace and quiet these days. Nancy's face flushed slightly. a faint wince pulling at her lips. She touched Derek's arm, whispering, "Maybe let's not, Mon." But Derek brushed her hand aside lightly, his attention fixed on the audience. Of course, we should all remember that. It's about knowing your place in life. Some people build, others just enjoy the fruits of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. Porter's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his expression remained calm. His hand rested lightly against the back of a chair, steady as stone. He had no need to defend himself here. Derek was giving him all the ammunition he needed. One of Derek's younger colleagues, a woman in a blue dress, offered a polite smile. "And what did you do before retirement, Mr. Wood?" "Nothing special," Porter said easily. "Just business. Enough to keep me busy." "See?" Derek jumped in quickly, humbled to the core. "I keep telling him he should enjoy himself more. I mean, we're in a different era now. Things move faster. The younger generation has to be sharper, more ambitious, more willing to disrupt the old ways." The colleagues laughed politely again, nodding as though Derek had said something profound. Nancy's eyes found her father's. For a moment, she seemed on the verge of speaking, of cutting Derek off before he embarrassed himself further. But Porter gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Let it play out," his expression said. The conversation turned to the wedding plans, but Derek wasn't finished. Over dinner, he maneuvered Porter into conversations with more colleagues, each introduction another chance to rehearse his script. "Mr. Wood's retired now," Derek repeated with casual authority. "Lives a modest life, enjoys gardening, that sort of thing. But he's a great guy, keeps things simple. Not everyone has to chase promotions, right?" Each word was a careful dismissal wrapped in politeness, the kind of arrogance that could easily be mistaken for charm if you weren't paying attention. Porter paid close attention. He catalogued every phrase, every smirk, every attempt to place him neatly below the ladder Derek was so desperate to climb. At one point, Derek leaned in with a conspiratorial grin, lowering his voice just enough to seem intimate, but loud enough for others nearby to hear. "You know, Mr. Wood, not everyone's cut out for the high-pressure world of sales. It's tough out there. Long hours, constant targets, stress that could knock a man flat. Honestly, I respect you for bowing out when you did. It takes self-awareness to know your limitations." Porter set down his glass of water, his movements measured, precise. "Limitations can be interesting things," he said softly. "Sometimes they're not where people expect them to be." The table went quiet for a moment, Derek blinking at the subtle pushback. Then he laughed, clapping Porter lightly on the shoulder. "That's the spirit, always the optimist." Later in the evening, as the rehearsal wound down, Porter excused himself to step outside. The air was cooler, quieter, the hum of traffic from Michigan Avenue faint beneath the weight of his thoughts. He stood near the hotel's entrance, watching the night settle over Chicago. Behind him, Derek's voice carried faintly from the lobby as he entertained a group of Technova colleagues, his laughter brimming with confidence. Porter turned slightly when Derek approached, Nancy trailing behind with an anxious expression. "Heading out already, Mr. Wood?" Derek asked. "It's been a long day," Porter said calmly. Derek nodded, smiling as though he'd just proven something to himself. "Well, tomorrow's the big day. Let's make sure everything goes smoothly. First impressions matter, especially with Walter there. He's a man who notices everything." Porter's eyes held Derek's for a long, deliberate moment. His voice was steady, quiet, but the weight of it pressed into the air like a hidden blade. "Tomorrow may surprise you, Derek." The younger man chuckled, dismissing it as the musings of a harmless retiree. "I'm sure it will," he said, adjusting his tie. "Biggest day of my life, after all." Nancy's gaze lingered on her father, worry written across her face. Porter gave her the smallest of nods, the kind that said everything was in hand. Then he turned and walked into the night, leaving Derek to bask in his own confidence. The stage was set. Every insult had been spoken, every dismissal carefully delivered. Tomorrow, in front of Walter and every eye that mattered, Derek would discover that his performance had been the rehearsal, and the real show was yet to begin. The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and bright, the kind of June day that Chicago seemed to save for rare occasions. The air was light with promise, and the Drake Hotel gleamed with polished marble and chandeliers as if it, too, knew this was a day of significance. Guests arrived in a steady stream, women in elegant dresses and men in tailored suits, their voices carrying excitement and admiration for the couple about to Wednesday. Nancy moved among them with radiant ease, her dress flowing as she hugged relatives and welcomed friends. The glow on her face seemed to brighten every corner of the lobby, though her eyes occasionally flicked toward her father as though to check his quiet composure. Porter remained calm, his presence understated but deliberate, a man blending in with grace. He greeted guests warmly, shook hands when offered, and carried himself as one might expect of an ordinary retiree. It was the role he had chosen, and he wore it like a second suit. Derek, on the other hand, strode through the crowd with the self-assurance of a man certain the world had aligned to his ambitions. His tuxedo was fitted perfectly, his smile bright and calculated, his hand never far from Nancy's waist. He spoke loudly enough for others to hear, remarking about the venue, the guest list, and the importance of the day in a tone that reminded everyone he was climbing quickly in his career. "It's not just a wedding," he said to one of his colleagues. "It's the kind of event where impressions matter." He cast a subtle glance at Porter as he said it, the kind of look designed to remind him of his supposed place in the hierarchy. Walter Klein arrived shortly after, distinguished in his navy suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his manner calm yet commanding. Heads turned as he entered, and Derek practically leapt to his side, greeting his boss with both deference and pride. "Walter, so glad you made it," he said, his voice carrying a little too much eagerness. Walter shook his hand with the detached warmth of a man who had long ago grown accustomed to such attention. His gaze swept the room, pausing briefly on Porter with the polite neutrality one reserves for strangers. The ceremony itself unfolded with quiet grandeur. The chapel's stained-glass windows painted the aisle with colors that danced across the polished floor. Guests filled the pews, whispers fading into reverent silence as the music swelled. Derek stood at the altar with his groomsmen, confident and tall, smiling as though the day were already his triumph. His colleagues sat in the front rows, their eyes trained on him, watching not only the wedding, but the man they expected to rise higher in their company. Nancy appeared at the doors on her father's arm, her dress glowing in the light. A hush fell over the room, followed by a collective sigh of admiration. Porter felt her grip tighten as they began their walk down the aisle. He kept his steps measured, his smile tender, his gaze fixed on his daughter. For this moment, the long game and its careful planning faded. It was only about her. At the altar, Derek's face softened genuinely as he looked at Nancy, though the flicker of triumph in his eyes returned when his gaze shifted briefly to Walter. He seemed to believe this was the moment everything aligned: his love, his career, his future reputation. Porter released his daughter's hand into Derek's, kissed her cheek, and stepped aside. His role as father of the bride was complete on the surface, yet beneath it lay the weight of what was coming. The vows were spoken with sincerity. Nancy's voice trembled with emotion as she promised her love and loyalty. Derek's tone was confident, smooth, carefully rehearsed but heartfelt enough to move the audience. The officiant guided them through the ceremony with solemn dignity, and when the words "husband and wife" were finally spoken, the chapel filled with applause and cheers. As the couple kissed, Derek's eyes flicked once again toward Walter, as though ensuring his mentor had witnessed the success of the moment. He beamed with pride, squeezing Nancy's hand tightly, as though to claim both her and the future he envisioned. Walter clapped politely, smiling with the warmth of a guest who had seen many such ceremonies before. Porter watched quietly, his expression calm, his thoughts already on what would follow. The recessional was a blur of smiles and photographs, the couple moving down the aisle while guests reached out to touch their hands, offer blessings, and capture snapshots of joy. Derek basked in the attention, his chest swelling each time someone congratulated him. His colleagues whispered approvingly, remarking on his confidence, his charm, and the way he carried himself. Derek absorbed it all like sunlight, feeding his ambition with every nod and compliment. Porter remained steady, greeting guests with polite warmth, content to let the day move forward as Derek believed it should. Every detail was falling into place exactly as planned. The ceremony had been flawless, the bride radiant, the groom confident, the guests enchanted. Derek believed his performance was nearly complete, his reputation secured in the eyes of Walter and his peers. But Porter knew the real ceremony was only a prelude. The applause, the vows, the polished smiles, all of it was the stage being set. The reception would be the true performance. And Derek, still glowing from his moment at the altar, had no idea how swiftly the spotlight was about to shift. As the guests filed toward the banquet hall, Derek leaned down to Nancy and whispered just loudly enough for Porter to overhear, "Everything's going perfectly. Walter's impressed. This is the best day of my life." Porter allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The day wasn't over yet. The reception hall shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, crystal light scattering across polished marble floors and gilded walls. Guests drifted inside, laughter mixing with the soft elegance of the string quartet playing in the corner. The tables were set with precision, ivory cloths, silver cutlery, and centerpieces of roses and lilies that filled the room with a delicate fragrance. The air was charged with celebration, the joy of the ceremony spilling effortlessly into the banquet. Derek moved through the room with the confidence of a man basking in triumph. His tuxedo caught the light at every angle, his smile unwavering as he guided Nancy from group to group. Colleagues from Technova clustered around him, eager to exchange congratulations, subtle enough to mask that they were also studying how their senior manager carried himself in front of his powerful boss. Every nod from Walter Klein, every polite laugh at Derek's anecdotes, seemed to confirm his belief that his reputation was secure. Nancy glowed beside him, her smile genuine but with an undercurrent of caution. She stayed close to Derek, but her eyes searched often for her father, who had chosen a quiet position near the edge of the hall. Porter observed the room with calm detachment, sipping from a glass of sparkling water, letting Derek enjoy the spotlight he craved. The stage was being set, and every moment was bringing it closer. The chatter grew louder as the crowd swelled, waiters carrying trays of champagne weaving through conversations. Derek spotted Walter near the windows overlooking Lake Michigan and practically pulled Nancy with him toward the corner. His voice carried just enough volume to ensure his colleagues nearby would hear. "Mr. Klein," Derek said proudly, "may I introduce my wife, Nancy, and her father." He gestured toward Porter with an almost dismissive hand. "This is Porter Wood. He's retired now, lives modestly in Evanston. An unemployed man these days, enjoying simple hobbies." The words floated across the space like perfume, with a bitter edge coating the air. Several nearby guests paused, listening with the faintest chuckle of polite discomfort. Derek smiled broadly, certain he had once again established hierarchy, making his boss see that he stood above the older man who had chosen soup over salmon at that dinner months ago. Walter's eyes, however, shifted slowly. They dropped to the gleam on Porter's cuffs, where the light from the chandeliers caught platinum cufflinks engraved with the Technova insignia. His expression froze, his practiced composure slipping for the first time that day. The silence that followed was subtle at first, then widened as conversations died away around them. "Porter?" Walter said, his voice edged with disbelief. He stepped closer, his hand reaching out before he even finished the word. "Porter Wood, what on earth are you doing here?" Derek blinked, confusion sweeping across his face. His confident smile faltered as he glanced between his boss and his father-in-law. You know him?" he asked hesitantly. Walter laughed once, the kind of laugh filled with warmth and shock all at once, before gripping Porter's hand with both of his. "Know him? Derek, this is my business partner. This is the man who co-founded Technova with me, the man who built half of what you stand on. His voice carried, deliberately or not, across the hushed banquet hall. The effect was instantaneous. Conversation stopped entirely. Glasses hung mid-air, waiters froze in place, and the soft music from the quartet seemed almost intrusive against the silence that had fallen. Eyes turned as the realization rippled outward, guests absorbing every word with astonishment. Derek's face drained of color. "Co-founder?" he whispered, his lips barely forming the words. "No, that's not possible. He faltered, choking on the word unemployed before it could escape again. Walter's eyes hardened, his grip still firm on Porter's shoulder. "Unemployed? Derek, this man has been my partner for over 3 decades. We started Technova in a garage, built it with sweat, sleepless nights, and sheer will. He is no retiree to be dismissed. He is the reason you even have a job." Gasps moved through the crowd. Nancy's cheeks burned as she stood rooted beside her husband, torn between love and mortification. She looked at her father, who remained calm, his expression unreadable but steady. Derek's lips moved, fumbling for words. His colleagues stared in wide-eyed shock, some whispering quietly, others simply watching his collapse in silence. His entire image, crafted with care, was unraveling faster than he could hold it together. I didn't know," Derek stammered, his voice breaking with desperation. "You never told me," Porter finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying to every corner of the hall without effort. "You never asked." The room erupted into a low murmur, guests turning the phrase over like a stone dropped in still water, each ripple widening the silence that had surrounded them. The weight of those words bore down on Derek like a physical blow. He staggered slightly, his shoulders sagging, his eyes darting frantically from Walter to Nancy to the colleagues who had once looked at him with admiration. Walter shook his head slowly, his disappointment palpable. "Derek, for months you have spoken of disruption, of dead weight, of the irrelevance of older generations. And all this time you dismissed the man who built your company because of a soup order and the clothes on his back." The murmurs grew louder, guests whispering harsh judgments. "Did you hear that?" one said. "Unemployed? That's the founder." Another, "He mocked his own father-in-law in front of everyone." Derek's hands shook as he tried to speak. "Mr. Klein, please, I didn't mean." Walter cut him off, his voice cold and precise now, the authority of decades in business sharpening every word. "You meant every word, and you revealed your character. That is something I cannot ignore." Derek's face crumpled, panic flooding his expression. He turned to Porter, his voice breaking. "Please, say something. Tell him I didn't know. Tell him." Porter looked at him evenly. "You treated me exactly as you believed me to be. That was your choice." The silence returned, heavier than before. The string quartet had stopped playing entirely. Instruments lowered as the musicians watched with the same awe as the guests. The humiliation was complete. Every eye on Derek as his confidence collapsed into something brittle and weak. Nancy's hand trembled as she clutched at his arm, her own face pale with shock. But Derek could barely register her presence. His career, his reputation, his marriage, all of it was unraveling before him. The threads pulled loose by his own arrogance. Guests began to shift, whispers cutting sharper now. He called him unemployed to his face. His own father-in-law. The words moved like wildfire through the hall. Walter's final words came quiet, almost sorrowful, yet unmistakably final. "You have embarrassed yourself, Derek, and in doing so, you've embarrassed this company. I will have to reconsider your place in it." Derek collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, shoulders shaking under the weight of every eye fixed upon him. The man who had boasted of disrupting paradigms, of tearing down the old guard, now sat destroyed by the revelation that the old guard had built the very world he occupied. Porter remained calm, his glass of water steady in his hand, his presence dignified. He had not raised his voice, had not struck back with insults or anger. The truth alone had been enough to dismantle Derek's facade. And as silence reclaimed the room, broken only by Derek's ragged breathing, every guest knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable. The silence in the banquet hall felt like glass stretched to the point of breaking. Derek sat pale and trembling, the weight of his collapse pressing on him from all sides. The wedding guests shifted uneasily, their polite laughter and conversation replaced by the murmur of disbelief. Nancy's hand was still on her husband's arm, though her eyes were drawn to her father, calm and steady in the storm. Walter Klein stood tall, his voice about to cut through the air with the authority of a man who had commanded boardrooms for decades. "Derek," Walter said, each syllable clipped and deliberate, "what I have just witnessed is beyond unprofessional. It is disgraceful. You introduced my partner, your father-in-law, as if he were a burden. You mocked him, diminished him, in front of his own daughter and in front of colleagues who will carry this memory for years." Derek's head snapped up, his eyes wild, his lips trembling. "Mr. Klein, please, I didn't know who he was. I never." Walter held up a hand, silencing him instantly. "Ignorance is no defense for cruelty. Respect does not require knowledge of status or wealth. Respect is the foundation upon which character is built. And tonight you revealed yours in front of everyone." The room stayed hushed, the judgment echoing across the marble hall. Walter's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping to a level that carried more threat than shouting ever could. "If this were Monday morning in my office, Derek, you would already be unemployed. Do you understand?" The words landed like blows. Derek's mouth opened but no sound came. He looked at Nancy, then at Porter, desperation bleeding into his features. "Please, Mr. Klein. Please, Porter. I made a mistake. I can learn. I can change." His voice cracked, pitiful, in contrast to the confident arrogance he had worn just hours before. Walter turned slightly toward Porter, as if seeking confirmation. "You've heard him begging, when hours ago he mocked you as if you were beneath him. I should end his career tonight. That is what his behavior deserves." Porter set his glass down on the nearest table. The sound of crystal meeting wood was soft, but it drew every eye. He stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without needing to raise his voice. "Walter," he said evenly, "you are right. Derek's behavior tonight has been shameful. He judged without understanding, he insulted without thought, and he mistook arrogance for strength. But if you fire him here, in this moment, all he will remember is the humiliation. He will not learn the lesson." Walter studied his partner, measuring the weight of his words. "And what lesson do you suggest?" Porter looked at Derek, who was staring up at him with a mixture of fear and hope. "That respect is greater than status. That titles, salaries, and appearances mean nothing if you cannot treat people with dignity. Derek must learn that lesson. And the only way he will is if he is forced to live with his failure, to face the colleagues who saw him stripped of his mask tonight, and to rebuild with humility." Derek's eyes filled with tears, his voice a whisper. "Please, give me that chance. I swear I will not waste it." Walter exhaled sharply, his jaw tight. He glanced again at Porter, who gave a single, steady nod. Finally, Walter spoke. "Very well, Derek Harrington. You will not be fired tonight. But hear me clearly. You are on probation. 6 months. Every action you take at Technova will be watched. One misstep, one hint of arrogance, and your career is over. Do you understand?" Derek nodded frantically, his hands gripping the edge of the chair as if to steady himself. "Yes, sir. I understand. Thank you. Thank you both." Walter wasn't finished. "Do not thank me. Thank the man you called unemployed. Thank the man who built the company you serve, and who has just saved you from destroying your life completely." Derek turned his eyes to Porter, his voice breaking. "Thank you. I don't deserve it, but thank you. I promise I will change." Porter held his gaze, not unkind but unflinching. Change is not a promise spoken in desperation. It is proven in choices. Starting now. The crowd exhaled collectively, tension easing into something softer, though the sting of the moment remained. Nancy wiped at her eyes, relief mingling with exhaustion. She slipped her arm through Derek's, grounding him even as his shame hung heavy in the air. Walter clapped Porter gently on the shoulder, the gesture full of respect. "You always were the wiser one," he murmured, his voice just loud enough for those closest to hear. The music resumed tentatively, the quartet sensing it was safe to return. Conversations picked up again, subdued at first, then growing as the guests processed what they had just seen. But no one would forget the image. A groom brought to his knees by arrogance, saved not by his own merit, but by the mercy of the man he had mocked. Porter returned to his seat, calm once more, his face composed. Derek remained standing for a moment, his posture stiff, his hands trembling before he slowly straightened. He had been spared, but the weight of probation and the eyes of everyone in the room would follow him long after the reception ended. Nancy leaned close to her father as Derek stepped away to gather himself. "Why did you save him?" she whispered. Porter's eyes softened. "Because, sweetheart, justice without mercy is just another form of cruelty. And tonight, he needed to learn both." Nancy nodded, tears still bright in her eyes. She squeezed his hand tightly, and for the first time that evening, she smiled. The night continued, laughter slowly returning, glasses clinking again. But beneath the surface of celebration lay the unforgettable lesson that would define not just a wedding day, but a lifetime. Respect over status. Character over appearances. Porter watched as Derek approached Walter again. Quieter now, humbled, listening instead of boasting. Perhaps the lesson had already begun to take root. And for the first time, Porter allowed himself a quiet breath of satisfaction. Not the satisfaction of revenge, but of knowing the right kind of justice had been served. The house was quiet when Porter returned that evening, the distant hum of the city fading as he shut the door behind him. He hung his jacket on the familiar hook, his fingers brushing the worn wood, and for the first time all day, he let himself exhale fully. The reception had ended hours earlier, the guests dispersing with stories they would carry to their homes, offices, and dinner tables. But here, in the stillness of his study, the noise of judgment and revelation melted away, leaving only reflection. He lowered himself into the leather chair that had carried him through decades of late nights and early mornings. The same desk where patents had been signed, strategies sketched, and breakthroughs recorded, now held only the quiet weight of memory. He looked at the framed photograph of himself and Walter, younger men in a cramped garage with nothing but conviction and the stubborn belief that they could change the world. Beside it sat the cufflinks he had worn, the subtle signal that had turned a reception into a reckoning. He placed them gently back into their case, shutting it with a deliberate click. The betrayal still stung, sharper than he cared to admit. Not Derek's arrogance. He had seen arrogance before, countless times in boardrooms and negotiations, but the willingness of his own daughter's husband to diminish him so easily, so publicly. That wound cut deeper. Yet he also recognized that the pain had served a purpose. Derek had been unmasked before it was too late. The lesson had been delivered not with fury but with precision, leaving him humbled rather than destroyed. Porter thought of Nancy, her eyes wide with fear, when she realized what was unfolding, her hand steady on Derek's arm when the man she loved crumbled. She had witnessed not only her father's patience, but also the cost of pride. In her silence at the garden months earlier, he had seen her doubts. Now, those doubts had been confirmed. She would not be blind to character again, not in Derek or in anyone. That was its own kind of justice. As for Derek, the image of him collapsing under Walter's words lingered. The confident young man who had measured worth by salary and status had been stripped bare, forced to confront the limits of arrogance. Whether he grew from it or allowed bitterness to take root would be his choice. Porter had given him mercy, But mercy carried responsibility. 6 months of probation would test him more than any congratulatory handshake or empty boast. Justice had been achieved, though not in the way some might expect. Porter had not sought Derek's destruction, though it would have been easy. Walter's instinct had been to sever the tie, to end the career with a single decisive stroke, but that would have left nothing behind but ruins. Porter wanted something else, a chance for Derek to rebuild. Not as a man who thought himself invincible, but as one who understood the fragile weight of respect. The lesson had cost pride, it had cost tears, but it had not cost a family. That, Porter thought, was the difference between revenge and resolution. Revenge leaves ashes. Resolution leaves room for growth. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes close for a moment. He could still hear Walter's words echoing in the banquet hall, sharp as a gavel. He could still see Derek's face, drained of confidence, and Nancy's hand gripping tightly as if to hold everything together. And yet beneath it all was a strange peace. The truth was out, the masks had been removed, and the path forward, while uncertain, was at least honest. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking the quiet hours. Porter rose at last, turning off the lamp. Betrayal hurt, but wisdom endured. His daughter was wiser, his son-in-law humbled, and he himself reminded that dignity, once claimed, never truly fades. He closed the study door behind him, carrying the calm certainty that justice had been served not through destruction, but through the quiet strength of truth. If your child's fiancé humiliated you in front of family and friends, would you stay silent, or would you teach them a lesson they would never forget? That's the question at the heart of this story. And now I want to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what you would have done in Porter's place. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you'll never miss another moment where betrayal meets justice. Every story here is about more than just revenge. It's about dignity, boundaries, and the surprising strength that comes when silence finally breaks. And remember, the story doesn't end here. The next chapter is already waiting. In the next video, we'll unravel a chilling twist. The day I discovered that someone had rewritten my will behind my back. That discovery didn't just test my trust, it changed the way I saw family forever. So ask yourself again, in the face of betrayal, do you let it slide? Or do you make sure the lesson lasts a lifetime?